My paper is entitled In Pursuit of Peace, Some Reflections on Ethics of Sustainability. And I would like to draw your attention to one Upadesham which I felt really got me thinking. I was reading Sri Sadhguru Uma's Upadeshams. Absolute peace comes from absolute renunciation, and we need to remember that. If you look at the World Conference on Environment and Development report, Our Common Future, in 1987, it comes up with a very promising definition of sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And in 2024, after 37 years, we are still grappling with the question of what kind of values would eventually bring a sustainable future for all. I think what we need to focus on here is that we haven't yet started to reduce our needs. Whether we fix our eyes on Riesi, we all know what happened, or Rafah, it is violence that is time and again taking the center stage, and all promises made so far seems bleak. People these days are truly living on the edge. And I was listening to Shrikala, and I realized that there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of hurt. We are desperately trying to make sense of the wide range of complex emotions like fear, despair, hurt, anger, and anxieties, which we have been carrying for generations together. Afflictions that only point towards a world that is caught in a trap of absurdity that defies our logic. And if we look at our media representations, what do we see? We see visuals of war crimes, injured and harassed people, mutilated bodies, damaged settlements due to incessant bombing, anxiety-ridden faces of children who do not know what to make of the violence perpetrated, and now the violence that comes from AI, not to talk of that. One wonders what would peace mean to the children who define themselves who find themselves caught in this mindless act of massive devastation that has taken siege over the different parts of this world. One shudders to think what kind of future these young children envisage for themselves, and what do they make of the narratives built around these horrific experiences? Do they even dream of better days? In fact, I was talking to some students in my college before writing this paper, and they all had one thing to say. Ma'am, we don't know the meaning of peace. And we also do not know what sustainable development means. I think we need to focus on these young people who are absolutely confused and scared with what's going on around us. I would go back to what Martin Luther King Jr. had said many years ago in 1968. He had said, this is actually no longer a choice between violence and non-violence. It's either non-violence or non-existence that is where we are today. And I think we haven't changed much. We are equally at a loss now as to, thinking as to how do we account for such colossal damages that has happened everywhere. Coming from Northeast, I have seen it with my own eyes, how people's houses have gone up in flames and they have nothing much to do about it. So who takes the responsibility for that loss? Now, yesterday, when Professor Selvadurai picked up that question of contesting national histories, he used a term, what is real history? And that really got me in. I want to just raise a question around this idea. Do we look at histories of events to decide who wronged whom? Would the unearthing of facts as to where lies the origin of discord and who should be held responsible help us to clear the differences and save lives? After all, we cannot forget that these facts which we collect over the years very selectively come with interpretations written and rewritten as narratives over different periods in time with specific intentions and purposes in view which we cannot afford to forget. So do we take sides and allow the violence to engulf whoever and whatever comes on its way? I think we need to just try this out. I mean, I don't know, I may be wrong, but I think history should also teach us. It definitely aids at truth telling, but it should also teach us how to bracket our memories sometimes. Because it is these memories which actually trigger enmity. So, going by what Johan Galtung, the Norwegian sociologist we all know about, talked on the concepts of personal violence and structural violence, one definition really stands out. He says, violence is present when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. This means one is made to realize his inability to bridge the gap between what one is and what one could be, either by force or by the inherent structures in the society. In case of personal violence, the perpetrator hits directly to incapacitate the victim, and in case of structural violence, people become victims when they find themselves caught in the wrong side of the power scale. Peace should counter both forms of violence, and it is the second form that needs more attention because of its sometimes glaring and at other times disguised presence in this world. We often just take up the glaring presence, but we don't much talk about the disguised presence. Hence, peacemaking cannot just bring an end to direct violence in a negative sense, but the real task is to bridge the gaps and fissures social structures have forged over the generations. So if we really want to talk about sustainable development, then we need to talk about the integration of the human society on this point, which I don't think so we have achieved till date. Now, going by what Galton tells us about positive peace and structural violence, I would like to say that if peace, say if we view it specifically as a social goal, where each and every individual's aspiration is included, then it becomes very clear that not every stakeholder may identify with the same set of social goals, and there may be a sharp divide among people as to what qualifies as a state of peace for them. And it is also possible that for those who are placed on the wrong end of the power structure might never get an opportunity to present their idea of concretizing social goals, which eventually might bring peace for them. And this is what we actually feel the people in Northeast, I would specifically bring in Manipur here, who think that they haven't been given the chance to concretize what they think is their social goal. Now, one thing is very clear, we cannot have a universal idea of peace. So, how do we then look at peace? Peace definitely is a multi-layered, multi-dimensional concept. At a personal level, peace could be a fulfillment of a desire aspired for, having a value scheme of artha, kam, dharma, and moksha in view that helps us to distinguish between what is beneficial and what is detrimental and needs to be avoided. Peace could also be a sustained effort of aligning and integrating one's coveted goal with one's fellow beings to pursue a greater good for all. And as a third possibility, peace could also be viewed as a pact or accord agreed upon unanimously for the benefit of a greater number. But unfortunately, these routes to peace may take on a different trajectory altogether. Firstly, at the personal level, peace could be understood as some kind of concrete state of happiness, or it could be just a realization that every person can experience at some rare epiphanic moment in one's life. I would call it one's face-to-face encounter with reality, a realization what one cannot but affirm for its sheer tangible force of facticity. That's the truth. Secondly, there begins the struggle of aligning one's goal with that of others, and in a bid to integrate human beings, individuals in power, quote unquote, often appropriate others who may lack the ability to project their opinions as markedly distinct. It remains to be seen who falls under the so-called all. Does it comprise of all and sundry, or fellow beings we identify with and relate to? There seems to always be an ever-shrinking, close-knit inner circle versus an ever-widening, invisible outer circle created simultaneously. Who belongs to which circle depends on how the self perceives the other. I'm reminded of what Dr. Shripriya had said when she mentioned about the in-groups and the out-groups. We have all read about Sumner's idea of in-groups and out-groups, and that is so very, very important in conflict situations. Hence, going by the dynamics of dominance, a conflict of interest is always invariably at play. As Sri Aurobindo had said, it is interest warring against interest that defines conflict. We all might have our own chosen way to pursue goals we deem fit to make our life worthwhile and bring fulfillment of our desires. In the process, what remains of peace is just an agreement or a pact tortuously arrived at. Mark the word tortuous. Often glossing over differences that continue to simmer for years together. Oftentimes, making a mockery of the so-called peaceful compromises made in the name of a greater number, where the number is found to be dwindling faster than one imagines, and a pact waiting to be dissolved. I guess it was true for the Treaty of Westphalia. It is true for every peace treaties that are made. The simmering tensions are just kept aside, pushed below the carpet. Much to one's disappointment, we may realize that people may not always look for a cohesive balance in deciding how much of artha and kama should be enough to make me realize my true dharma. I was touched by Sir's statement that a time will come when there will be no dharma, there will only be karma. So how does it eventually prepare me to become a self-legislating individual who can discriminate between the freedoms and unfreedoms, to take Amartya Sen's word, at play in this world we live in? It is we who have essentially turned this world into an uneven, disharmonized and chaotic set of relations we eventually lost control of. Thus, in some way or the other, we are caught in the mesh of structural violence, where divisions deepen and dualisms are created, and none can escape from the process of othering. Justice in such a scenario, which has been pointed out by many before, seems to be a far off ideal. I don't know whether it is real or not, and does not quite play the role of synthesizing the basic values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In fact, we cannot really talk of peace where beings are devalued and overlooked as bare beings bereft of rights, marginalized and pushed aside to the fringes of the societies. I think whenever we have peace discourses on peace, it should start with the people who are living on the fringes. Instead of talking about the power clusters, we should begin from the bottom. Then only perhaps we can make some sense of it. Judith Butler very rightly points out how it becomes crucial to dwell on the question, whose life counts as living? Assets, assertions, and acclamations have always been perceived as prerogatives of the powerful and the articulate. We find the voiceless poor, weak, and the dispossessed are either appropriated, then it is all fine, peace, peace, or pushed to the zone of the non-being, to use Frantz Fanon's words. So identities oscillate between the dominant and the despised, depending largely on the social positioning and perceptions which regulate not only our social transactions, but also lived realities to a large extent. One can see a rapid shifting of loyalties and responsibilities, pardon me for saying this, subject to opportune moments in time. In a bid to wield power, more power clusters are formed, giving rise to a never-ending power struggle between extremely polarized groups of people not willing to see eye to eye and let alone be ready to listen. I think that's where the problem lies. We are not willing to see the reason or speak to each other. I wish to draw attention to this fact that only a moral stand on the part of an individual can be of help to counter this conundrum. We need to recognize that we are already placed, as Butler points out in her book, in a force field of violence. So whatever stand we take, we are in some way or the other putting forth our views that may appear as violent. I may not want to be the threat, but I naturally become the threat for others. Initiating a disagreement or conflict we never chose to be in. So a plea for peace in this sense also may be perceived as violent, a kind of protest against the prevailing conditions. In such a case, how do we initiate a peace process? I wish to suggest that from a moral point of view, we firstly need to recognize the fact that we are all caught up in this highly competitive, violent currents of existence. Each individual shares a similar predicament and is in a continuous struggle to make a space for oneself. What one needs to create is a shared space, notwithstanding the disagreements which might come about. And I think reasonable disagreements are healthy and should be encouraged. And this is possible only when the other's presence is acknowledged and accepted as a fellow moral agent having equal intrinsic worth. Human beings must stop perceiving themselves as sole arbiters of justice. We are part of a larger network of relationships, and it is this interrelationality that defines and makes us who we are. In fact, we are social beings and cannot separate ourselves from the social realities we are embedded in. An acceptance of this fluid status, where we are continuously participating in an interconnected network of relations belonging to many things, beings, and events of this phenomenal world, like us or may not be like us, and that is our identity. We cannot raise ourselves above these differences. Self, in this sense, is constitutive of the other. Devaluing the other imperils the quality of one's own life. It is aggressive partisanship that has brought in conflict and the mad rush of projecting one's own identity against all odds and by all means. Peace lies in unmaking the identity we have constructed for ourselves, or as Iris Murdoch calls it, the unselfing of ourselves, much in consonance, of course, with the Buddhist idea of anatmavad. That is, transcending the limits of ego and acknowledging the reality we are part of, but cannot and need not always control. Secondly, an initiative for peaceful reconciliation requires trust. And this trust should be totally unconditional and also, I would like to add, arbitrary. It is arbitrary power and arbitrary trust. I think we should choose arbitrary trust. It is absolute trust which need not be pinned to any motive whatsoever, which can actually help us to build up this dialogical relationship between people, parties, or the different relations which are working at in the society. So where both parties are equal players and not tied up in a sharply lopsided, unequal arrangement, all along fearing that they might be misrepresented and reduced. As beings, we cannot afford to ignore the vulnerability and precariousness that characterizes our life. We are equal in this temporal resting place. We have no option but to accept this precarity and yet trust that we will find a way to survive it. We pin all our hopes on this claim with the desperation of a child, trusting all along to be taken care of. A child can only trust, can't do much about it anyway. It is trust that opens up the possibilities of a livable world, and we must take that leap of faith alone in our own capacity, notwithstanding the anxiety and dread that it involves. For therein lies the fiercely aggressive moral choice of forever being in pursuit of peace for a sustainable future for all. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the words of 13th century Persian philosopher and mystic Rumi Jalaluddin Balkhi. He says, "Being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture, still Treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, to shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. I hope for some divine interventions which will always make us look for the beyond, what we cannot see. If we can practice this, we have practiced empathy and respect, and perhaps we will be on the way of sustainable, equitable future for all. Thank you.